exploring John's Gospel. This week we're going to be looking at John chapter 13, and particularly John chapter 13 verses 1 to 17, which is the story of Jesus washing the disciples' feet. And we want to look a bit deeper into this story. It's one which is well known in the church. It's well known for those who've had any connection with Christianity for a long time. The concept of washing feet, and it's often connected with Easter, and often connected in some ways also with an image or a concept of forgiveness and so on. But I'm going to offer possibly a different explanation for it than the concept of forgiveness, and in fact even of service, but maybe to look a little bit deeper into that concept. So let's listen again to the story of Jesus washing the disciples' feet in John chapter 13. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "Those who have had a bath need only wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." It's really a wonderful passage, such a fantastic narrative, the story, and then the altercation with Peter, the concept of washing his own disciples' feet, and then of course the command at the end that we are supposed to follow his example and to do what he did. But in order to understand what he did, we need to take some time to reflect on the passage. And so I really would want you to just spend some time just thinking about the passage, and maybe even imagining yourself in that situation, possibly imagining yourself as one of the disciples reclining around the table, and Jesus coming to wash your feet. What does that feel like? What does that conjure up for you? What are some of the thoughts and understandings that you would get from it? Let's spend a bit of time and reflect on that. Welcome back. We need to just have a look a little bit at context. And we've now got up to Passover. It's the day before Passover, or it's just before Passover festival. Now, sometimes we might think of that is that the Passover festival is one day, but it's not. In fact, Passover goes over an entire week. And so we're not quite sure exactly what this means, that it's just before Passover, but it's most probably just before the day before or at least it's the day before, they're going to kill the lambs for the festival itself. And that's part of what John's developing. He's moving towards the climax of that situation, where he's going to be handed over to the authorities and then going to be the Passover lamb. But the interesting thing is that really for the next 4 chapters, so chapter 13 all the way through to chapter 17, really takes place in the same spot, kind of most probably in the upper room. Now, John doesn't tell us where they are. John doesn't give us that information as the synoptic gospels do in terms of setting up the upper room and getting that all ready and everything like that. The reality here is that what we have is just a story that they've met together. They're in some room in Jerusalem. And this is all, the next 4 chapters are all going to happen basically over this period. And the next 4 chapters are really important. It's the kernel of what Jesus has come to do. It's the understanding of what's it all about and how we connect with it and how we survive through it. In fact, the next 4 chapters are going to contain the last 2 of the I am sayings. So this is really very important before we get to the crucifixion. This is the last block of Jesus' teaching for the people, for his disciples. And so that's got to give you some understanding of context. The context here is of Jesus kind of preparing for this last time to be able to talk to his disciples, for this last opportunity to be able to teach them, to be able to share with them, and in fact, not only to share with them, but to pray with them. We're going to get to chapter 17, which is sometimes called the high priestly prayer, where Jesus prays for his disciples and in fact for the world at large. So this first section is vitally important to understand the next 4 chapters. And that's why I want to say to you is that it's more than just about service. It's more than just about being a servant. And we will talk about that. It's actually about saying, how do we live out the Christian life and our relationship with Jesus? In fact, the next 2 I am sayings are all about relationship. And this particular passage starts off by giving us a sense of how that relationship works, of how that relationship will connect. Now, if we had to say that there's one word that really is at the core of all the whole Christian gospel, it's that word, relationship. And I think that that's the context that we need to take away from this passage, that Jesus is showing his disciples that in fact he's not just a person of authority. He's not just somebody who has been their leader, has been somebody who's been their teacher, but actually somebody who he is wanting to be in relationship with them. And that's where the symbols and the connections of the story will come from. Of course, in the midst of this concept of relationship comes the story of Judas. And I think that Judas is such an important figure within the story, and one which too often we kind of leave out. We try to ignore Judas, and I think at our peril, because wherever Jesus and wherever the church is trying to build and foster relationship, there will be those who are undermining that relationship. Now, we're going to see much more about this next week when we talk about Judas's particular betrayal. But it's in this week here where we're told a bit more. In fact, we're given a bit of biographical history about Judas. It says that he was the son of Simon Iscariot. Now, it's interesting that it's only John that actually tells him, or at least addresses him that way, that he's Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, almost as if the people who would be reading this would have had some knowledge of who Simon Iscariot was. I mean, why else would you name his father if, in fact, he's not known to the church? And yet, the interesting thing in John's gospel is that there's a sense in which there's an external force utilizing John or utilizing Judas to actually then do what he's going to do. That betrayal is not just going to come out of Judas's own perspective, but it says the devil had already prompted Judas. Now, I think that that's, again, an important point in context here, because often people question why did Judas do what he did? Some people think that he's a zealot. Some people think that he was jealous of Jesus. Some think that it was just the way in which he could twist Jesus's arm to go and do something by kind of betraying him to the people. Judas looks at it very differently, or at least John looks at Judas very differently. What he does is he actually says that Judas has been influenced by evil. Now, remember that one of the themes of John's gospel is that Jesus has come to eradicate evil, has come to bring good so that evil might be destroyed. I think what he's trying to do here is he's trying to show us that the evil that we particularly need to watch out for is not only the evil that will come from outside, but evil that will actually transform the people who are on the inside. Judas was one of the disciples. Judas was one of the ones that Jesus himself had chosen, as we heard in the previous week. And yet, Judas is the one who's going to betray him. I think it makes me feel that too often the church is betrayed not so much by the people who are outside of it, but more often than not, the true betrayal of Jesus is by those who are inside the church. And it's those who are in the church who act more like Judas than like Jesus. And particularly in terms of this story, in this story where Jesus goes and washes his disciples' feet. I think that that's such an important way in which we understand about Jesus's role, because notice that Jesus, when he's washing the disciples' feet, wash all of their feet, including Judas. It says that the devil had already prompted Judas. And then it tells us about Jesus washing each of the disciples' feet. Maybe it tells us something about the way in which we need to even approach those within the church who have actually evil intent. Jesus still was prepared to serve them, was still prepared to welcome them, was still prepared to give them the benefit of the doubt in that reality. I think that gives us lots to think about in terms of context and in diving deeper into some of this story. And so let's do that now as we reflect on that it is Passover, that it is the time, in fact, when Judas is taken over by the prompting of evil, by the reality that, in fact, maybe what we need to watch out for in the church more often is that which happens within than that which actually comes from outside. Let's spend a bit of time reflecting on those ideas. Welcome back. As we look at the symbols of this particular story, there's two obviously that we need to look at. The one is, of course, the washing of the disciples' feet, and the other is then where he calls himself teacher and Lord. And I think both of those are important for us to understand the symbolic value of the washing of the disciples' feet. So in ancient Israel, what would have happened, of course, is that as the people came to a dinner, they would recline at the table. And you may remember from a previous week, what that meant was that you would lie with your head towards the table and you'd be resting on your left side. And we'll see more about that next week as well when we hear about John talking to Jesus. But the thing with it is that even though they're there, all their feet, of course, would all be the furthest away from the table. And it was often the job of the lowest slave or the servant to come and to wash each of the guests' feet. You can imagine living within a dusty environment, that having your feet washed would be a great opportunity or a great sense of welcome and of hospitality. And so one way to welcome and make people feel hospitable would be to wash their feet as part of their welcome to the meal. Now, of course, what this proves in this passage, though, is that nobody was prepared to take that role. All the disciples all went and reclined with Jesus, thinking, well, we're the disciples. We're not the slaves. We're not the servants. So why should we have to do this? And of course, it's in the midst of this that Jesus then says, no, I'm going to do this. And he gets up and he disrobes and then puts a towel around him and then fills a basin with water and begins to wash the disciples' feet. Now, of course, this is an act of a servant. It's something that a servant would do. But I want to say to you that I think in John's gospel, it is far more than just about service. You know, I think that what we could do is we could reduce this down to that Jesus is a servant, and so therefore I should be a servant as well. Is that true? Of course it is. Of course it is. But is that really what the symbols are about? And I don't think so. I think that the symbols are actually far more than that. I think the fact that he talks later on about being washed, and in the interaction with Peter, where Peter says to him, then wash all of me, in a sense, kind of thinking or harking towards the concept of immersion baptism, that we need to be baptized, that we need to be washed clean. I think that, in fact, Jesus's act of washing the disciples' feet was an ultimate act of relationship. You see, I think that what Jesus is actually doing when he's washing their feet is he's doing a symbol of saying that unless you are part of me, and that's what he says to Peter. He says, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. That's not just about service. That's actually about relationship. And what he's actually saying is that what's going to come next, all the stuff that's going to happen in terms of the crucifixion and all of the sense of betrayal from Judas, etc., for us to deal with all of that, the only way we're going to be able to, the only way we're going to really connect is if, in fact, we are in relationship with Jesus. And that's where I believe that the basin and the water and the towel are actually symbols of how we build relationship. We build relationship in service to each other. We build relationship in being prepared to be hospitable to each other. And I'm not talking about hospitality which says, well, I'll look after you, but expecting you to look after me. I'm talking about a relationship that's based in the kind of love that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 13, the kind of love that has no condition. That's what Jesus shows in the bowl or the basin and the towel. It's not just service. You see, I think that service is maybe one component of relationship. But really, service is the way in which we live out that relationship. And what Jesus is talking about here is he's talking about the fact that he's got a special relationship with those disciples. Now, he acknowledges the relationship that he's had. And he says that I've been your teacher, I've been your Lord. Now remember the two Hebrew words for that would be Rabbi and Adonai. Adonai being Lord, Rabbi being teacher. And yes, those two again are filled with the symbolism and with the reality of what Jesus has done with the disciples. He's been their teacher. He's taught them. He's taught them the parables. He's shown them the miracles. He's spent time with them. He's been their Lord in the absolute sense of being their rabbi. They've been following him. They do what he says. They connect with him. But now there's another aspect that he comes to this. Is that he's not only their teacher, he's not only their Lord, but he's also their friend. He's also the one who wants to be in relationship with them. You see, I think that in fact it's so much more than about being a servant. I think it's about being a friend. I think it's about actually being in a close relationship with him. I think it's that close relationship with him that actually is why he says to Peter, I have to do this. Because unless I wash you, unless I show you service, unless I show you hospitality, unless I show you welcome, unless I open my life to you, unless I make myself vulnerable to you, then you're going to have no part in me. If all that I'm ever going to be for you is your teacher and your Lord, then that's not enough. For me, again, it's what I celebrate in Christianity, is that Jesus doesn't want us to put him on some pedestal high and lifted up. Jesus doesn't want us to actually see him in that way. In fact, Jesus wants us to see him as both teacher and Lord, but also as friend. And as friend, as brother, he will be prepared to die for us. As brother, he will actually welcome us and draw us into life, which of course is the celebration, the theme of Passover. And so I think that this passage is so much more important than just saying Jesus is a servant, we should be a servant too. In fact, Jesus is so much more than a servant, and he wants a relationship with us that is so much more than just about service. He wants a relationship with us which would actually be intimate and close and connected, because we need that in order to deal with the Judases within the church and the Pilate and Romans and the other persecution that we might receive from outside the church. I'd like us to reflect on that, to think about what it means for Jesus to be more than just our teacher and our Lord. Welcome back. In this section, we want to talk about how we apply this passage to ourselves. And as I've said before, so often this is applied in terms of being a servant. Jesus is the example of servanthood, so we should be a servant too. I personally find that's not enough. What I get out of this passage is two things. The first one is where Peter says, you will never wash my feet. You will never wash my feet. I have a feeling that that's really something that echoes through the ages. That Jesus says to me, or says to us, that he wants to come and wash our feet. That he wants to have an intimate relationship with us. He wants us to be welcomed and made connected with him. But our response is similar to Peter's. We want to keep him up there. We want to keep him on the pedestal. We want to keep him at arm's length. In fact, we're quite happy for him to be teacher and Lord. Because when he's teacher and Lord, it means that we can then go on and do our lives separately. We can live our lives by ourselves. We can do our own thing. And then every now and then we can give lip service to our teacher and Lord. And in fact, we can even say Jesus is such a great teacher. And yes, Jesus is my Lord. But then spend no time. Spend no intimacy. Spend no opportunity of growth and development with him. We may even serve as he does. Unfortunately, too often then our service becomes almost a rite of passage or something that we need to be thanked for or we need to be acknowledged for. Notice Jesus wasn't looking for acknowledgement when he washed his disciples' feet. The washing of his disciples' feet was an expression of love. The truth of it is that too often we are a little bit like Peter. I will never let you wash my feet. I don't want to have an intimate relationship with you. Because when I do that, then I need to spend time with you. Then I not only need to hear what you're saying, but I need to do it. And to a large degree, I don't want to do what you say because that curtails what I want to do for myself. The other issue that I get out of this passage, or the concept I get out of this passage, is where Jesus says that if this is my example, then how much more should you do so also? I have set you an example. And to say that the bar is high is an understatement. It's an incredible bar that Jesus sets. And yet, that's the example that he sets. The example of hospitality. The example of unconditional love. Of unconditional acceptance. Even washing the feet of Judas, who he knew the devil had already prompted to betray him. That's a high example. But I think what it does in terms of application for us is it asks us, what's the example that we're showing? How can we live out our lives in a way that is an example to those around us? What is it that we need to be watching out for? What is it that we need to be, in what way do we need to be living so that in fact our example might shine into the world as well? I'd like you to spend finally some time thinking about those two things as we apply this particular story to our lives and saying, in what ways do we say to God, or to Jesus rather, no, I don't want you to wash my feet, because we really don't want to be as closely connected to him? And in other ways, how do we learn to follow his example? Maybe what is it of his example that is most difficult for us to follow? Let's spend some time and talk about that.